It is a special 18th of June edition of Flyers Daily with Jason Myrtetus. We've got Bill Meltzer once again. We've got Flyers Assistant General Manager Brent Flahr joining us as we preview the 2025 NHL Entry Draft. And so much to talk about in a year where it feels like you try and gather up all your picks. Like you pick them up off the floor like socks in the laundry, and they keep falling out of your hands. You can't get it all in one load. But joining us for this episode, Bill and I, is Brent Flahr. Brent, do you feel like you've got a plethora of picks this year?
Certainly more than I'm used to, but no, it's you don't like to be in these situations where you go through the years we have. But the one perk is that we have all these picks, and it gives you a lot of ammunition to do a lot of things where you take all the picks, move up, down, potentially trade for players or whatever it may be. But when you have the number of picks we have, it gives you options, which makes it exciting.
One of the things that a lot of people have said, I know talking with Jonesy at Talks introductory presser, that this year's draft is maybe there's not the superstar talent, but there's pretty good depth in terms of guys that should be quality players, particularly with all the picks you have in that top 50 range, even all the way up to the top 5 or 6, where there's guys are fairly equal after in that range. Guys who want to go 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th in that range. There's a lot of guys you like. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I think there's the top 10, 11 players, whatever the line is there for certain teams. You're getting the good players. They're you got different types of players. Maybe some players that are a little closer to playing than others, but they all have the potential to be real good NHL players here going forward.
Brent, one of the words Bill and I talked about on Monday's episode was the word pivot when it comes to building a roster. I imagine if we lined up 30 of your compadres across the league, 31 of the other GMs or assistant GMs or the heads of their drafts, I don't know that any two would agree, maybe not even on the top 5 players, but the order they'll be taken. How much the variables at 6 are aplenty in a draft like this.
For sure. And then as you go down the draft, you're going to see it go off the map. I've read perceived draft boards and fantasy drafts and stuff like that, and from media and whatnot. But you're going to see a lot of things that go probably off the rails a little bit as far as what people perceive as the order. So, which makes it exciting. There's there's some good players, but there's different evaluations from different teams, and makes the draft exciting.
In terms of the general crop that's available this year, I mean, you've seen the same public rankings that I have too. It's very center heavy, or guys who might end up on the wing, but they're playing center right now. That does tend to match up with an organizational need. But there's also a couple quality wingers and a defenseman or two that might be in that range there. If guys are fairly equal in your rankings, does that swing it a little bit if a guy is a center or may be able to play center as a pro?
Yeah, we're going to look at, obviously we know our needs within the organization. We have needs in different areas, especially early at 6. We're going to be going for the best player. We can't draft by position there. If it's dead even, maybe you go there. But no, I think at 6 we're going to be taking the best player regardless of position.
Brent, how does the fact that the draft is not decentralized? Maybe I should ask you this after the draft, but it's not it's decentralized this draft come around. Obviously, you guys were at the Combine in Buffalo, and that was really the opportunity to be face-to-face, not only with the draft prospects, but your fellow front office and hockey operations staff. How does that play into this draft come, when it begins? Is there any variable that adds to it?
Yeah, it changes a little bit. The previous drafts, you have the opportunity to meet with players, meet with agents. Everybody's in the same city, even on draft day to make a trade. They have access to phones, but sometimes it's just as easy to walk over the next table and try to make a trade. So those things are what we're used to. So we're going to have to do the groundwork earlier, have potential trades in place days before, or at least in the morning of the draft, and certain scenarios work out, make those deals. But no, it's fine. Logistically, it's easier for us to get to in some cases, but at the same time, to have everybody in the same city is fun. And I like the draft the way it was, but at the same time, there are perks to this as well for people. So I'm fine either way, and we'll make it work.
When you're evaluating best available player, are you looking for the guy with the most diverse skill set, or maybe if a guy has a particular area where he really stands out above everybody else, but he's not maybe as well rounded? Would he tend to be ranked higher, lower, in the middle, depending on what that asset is, versus whether a guy's a 200-foot player? You know, he can set up plays, he can score, but maybe there are other guys who do each particular area maybe a little bit better. Are you looking for the total package, or just in terms of, hey, who has the highest ceiling maybe in one or two areas?
Yeah, in a lot of those cases, that's what we're looking for. Obviously, you're looking for an elite trait or multiple elite traits for the top end guys. If it's just a strength issue or whatever, we can help them with that, or just a minor skating issue, we can help them with that going forward. There's certain things in the game, as you know, that you can't be taught, and these guys have it. The top players have it, whether it's hockey sense, skill. You know, in some cases, size comes into play, and just natural athletic ability. So, and character obviously is another huge one. So, but these are the things we look at, and obviously you want a well-rounded player if possible. But we can certainly help if a player lacks, it's a gifted offensive player that lacks some defensive attributes. We can certainly help them with that, and that's what our coaches are paid and development guys are paid to do.
You know, it's interesting, Brent, because over the years, the maturity of the prospect, the draft eligibles, to me, has gone up. We see it just after they're drafted, the way they carry themselves. They're almost media savvy and trained. How has that changed over the years? Because, you know, we can look at all the numbers on paper that you can, and you can evaluate only so far to that. You mentioned, you know, you got to bring guys in from a hockey standpoint on the ice, the field of play, but also the culture, guys that are winners, and through that interview process, talking with their coaches and other players they've played with, you can learn a ton. How has that changed? How has that evolved over the last decade? Is it on a rapid evolution, or has it been just kind of a status quo evolution? Because I would imagine in the world that we live in today, with so much virtual, that it's almost forced some of these draft prospects to be better in that regard earlier.
Yeah. And to be honest, people have these top young players. Some of these guys have been exposed to the media for years now, so they're used to it. They're used to talking in front of cameras. And then we have other kids, maybe they're playing high school or lower levels, that haven't. So we take that into account when we're interviewed. And some kids are a little more raw, which I actually like, because they're a little more honest and less prepared. So, but we take that stuff into account. All these kids, a lot of them, depending on where they live, are exposed to high-end training at younger ages now too. It's training specifically for hockey, while you get other multi-sport athletes that haven't even trained specifically for hockey yet. And that's the difference between hockey draft, when we're drafting 17, 18-year-olds, versus the NFL draft, where these kids have played at an elite college level and, trained, and they're more mature and ready to step in right away. So that's a challenge for us, but it makes it exciting, and obviously a lot of experience, and we've gone through a lot of drafts where you learn a lot of these things. And another thing with certain types of players, it doesn't matter how talented they are. If there's something, a character issue, or if you're not going to fit into a locker room, or not going to help you win when it matters, there's no point really drafting them early. So just some of those things we just look at.
When you're evaluating traits, and it's not a secret that the gold standard in scouting across the league has gone back to it's gone to a combination really of size and mobility, particularly in defensemen, bigger defensemen who can also really skate. Not if a smaller blue liner is super skilled, he'll still get picked. But when you're evaluating where a player might end up ultimately, how much do you weigh that maybe a guy who's maybe a little bit raw right now, but has a set of tools, the size and the speed, and maybe as he fills out a little bit, the strength will come with it. You might be able to maybe willing to take a little bit more of a risk on the guys a little bit more raw than maybe a smaller guy who has a high end skill, but maybe a little bit of a ceiling because he's never going to get too much bigger, or his body type isn't such where he's going to get a lot stronger.
Yeah, it depends how high end the skill is and the hockey sense level is with a smaller player. There's still room for smaller players in the game. However, guys, big guys that can play are valuable. A lot of times, almost 99% of the time, they take longer to get there, which is part of the challenge. And we got to be patient. Fan base has to be patient with some of these guys that they just take time to grow into their bodies, get the coordination, and then work on their game. So, but size does matter. You watch in the playoffs; it's a grind. You watch Florida Panthers when it's a heavy game. It's a hard game, and you got to get through all those wins in the playoffs if you want to get to the ultimate prize. So it's something that we are aware of. At the same time, you got to make sure you don't go buy a high end talent just for size alone.
But you guys obviously organizationally have the guys on that prospect path, the arc, that are coming from different routes, whether that's playing overseas, whether that's playing in the KHL, a guy like Zaragan, for example. Obviously, Matt Vey came via that route, albeit early. You got guys in the CHL, you got collegiate players. As a former collegiate player yourself at Princeton University, the college route has become a lot bigger trend in the NHL these days. It does come with some risk of obviously involved in it, where a guy can stay and then decide his own path. But with the new CHL rules and collegiate and that almost transfer portal, does that change how you look at any players? And I imagine the college player you do look at different now than you did 15, 20 years ago because of the frequency with which they come through it.
Yeah, no, it's unique. And we'll get, even some of these players and agents, aren't sure what to do because, some of these kids all think and want to play next year. Reality, it's just not reality as far as where they are physically and whatnot. So in some case, not a lot of these kids have the option. You've seen a lot of these commitments recently. They're going into college next year. And for, the top end player, maybe it's the best thing. You're playing against older players and be challenged. I do think college hockey is great. I think the CHL is also a great development league, and we're going to see how that evolves. You're going to see some guys maybe go to college too early, potentially struggle short term, and then you realize when the right time is to go to college. But sometimes in the draft year, it could potentially hurt your case. So we'll see how it works out. But I think they all figured out. The USHL has been used to this process, as was pointed out by the USHL guys. That's what they've had to deal with forever. So it might make the CHL leagues younger, which at the same time is great. But whatever works out, but it also gives us some options. Maybe have a player that needs an extra year, not quite ready for the American League, that can go to the collegiate level for a couple of years, and you get them at 21, 22 rather than 20. So there's a lot of things that we're going to get used to with this new process, but I think it can also favor us as well.
The EO College Diner grilled stickies up at Penn State, Brent.
Yeah,
what a guy who was at your former university, Guy Godowski, doing a good job there. They've been on the radar. Any trips to Happy Valley planned this year?
I was there last year.
There.
I enjoy my time there. It's
awesome.
It's a great place to watch games.
Yeah,
great environment, and I'm happy to see Guy get some. He's done a great job there right from the start, and he's a great man. He's got a ton of juice, and just knowing the players at Princeton that played for him and loved him, and guys that run through a wall for him. So he's got some high end talent coming in, and that's awesome to see for him. I'm really happy for him.
When you're weighing some of the secondary factors, this isn't a primary thing, but do you look at whether a guy comes from a developmental program at the junior level in Europe or wherever with a reputation of being a winning culture? Because you want to have one here as well. Obviously sometimes players can't obviously help what system they develop in, but is it a bit of a help if a player comes from a system where they have a tradition and expectation of winning, where they're in the hunt in the later part of the season, so that their guys are competing, for ice time or whatever the case might be at that level, or is it something you figure, well, we're trying to build that here, and regardless of where a guy comes from, if he's going to fit here, he's going to fit here.
Well, I think, to be a part of a winning culture is huge for any young player. But it's not the be all end all. Like, you have some players that are drafted on lesser teams, and sometimes it's just as impressive to see a player put a team on their back and get them into the playoffs or do certain things. And you see their individual commitment and what they did to be a leader and to get the team to that far, and maybe more so than a player that's a lesser part on a really good team that won a championship. I think there's value in that too, just from learning to win and watching older players and just being a part of it, accepting a role and winning. I think there's values in all those things, but it's certainly, everybody wants to draft winners. That's a fact. Even our guys that we've previously drafted to win a Memorial Cup, there's very few people that have an opportunity to do that and to win and to learn to win. It's it's something they'll remember forever, but they also know what it takes to go to that grind and playoff hockey. And it doesn't matter what level. It's a great learning experience, and it's something that'll help them when they step into the pro game here.
Never a bad thing when you're drafting players out of London and
No.
the Knights in that program. That's a preparation course for the NHL and being a pro. Brett, you look at this draft class, and it's something you have to evaluate every year, is players that come in off of a year where they miss some time due to injury. We see that with Schaefer. We've seen that in the past. Studying the medicals obviously is part of the equation. But when you look at it and you weigh that part of it, you go, this guy, he was dealing with a shoulder. Shoulders are always a little tricky, or whatever the injury might be. How detailed information can you guys get on a player's injury? Obviously there's HIPAA laws and all of that stuff, but player also wants to move himself up the board as well.
Yeah.
How much of that is a consideration, and how much info do you get?
We've got a lot. We got all the information we needed. The NHL Central Scouting has done a great job. This year is unique just because there's so many injured players. They allowed our medical staff to come to the combine, do their separate interviews. Previously, they already provided MRI information that our doctors needed to see where their status is, where they are now physically. But
is that the first time you brought doctors to the combine?
Correct. Or medical staff. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's, before you could fly them in, it just makes the process easier. So these players don't have to fly to 31 or 32 cities, and just makes sense. But, we obviously, most of these guys are, they're injured. Some of it's major, some of it's minor, but for the most part, these guys have all healed, or they will heal, and our doctors are satisfied with where they're at. And there are a couple cases where maybe not, and there's some questions, but which maybe a player may fall a little bit further, but still maybe value at the right point.
This year's draft is kind of unique because the guy many project to go first is a very young player. I mean, he doesn't he barely falls in the classification to be able to qualify for this year's draft. But in many cases, sometimes you see guys who are late birth year players from, they missed the cutoff from the previous year just by a little bit. Does that weigh? How much, I guess, does that weigh in when you're talking to your scouts, when you're doing evaluations? If a guy is born in late September or there's an October birthday, and versus a comparable player, comparable right now, who might be a June to August kind of birth, like a year ago, Jet Luchenko was he's a late August birthday, so he was almost a year younger than some of the other guys. Do you weigh that when you're evaluating?
Yeah, for sure. In some cases, you can just see the physical development, sometimes even the maturity level of the kids. There's a big difference, and sometimes in this age group, just by 1 year. So we do take that into account in some cases. And in the case you're referring to there, he's a special player, and to see what he does at that age, and where he is physically, even it was pretty impressive. So I didn't get to play a lot of games, but you didn't need to see him a whole bunch to figure him out either. So,
Brett, what's the arc of the value of a pick? Because we're out of the pandemic now. We're in this rising cap world. A lot of teams are entering a different phase of the fiscal puzzle where they have a rising cap. They can start to add. Some teams are going to use that as an opportunity to weaponize players or cap space for other teams to be able to make some maneuverability. How has the value of first round picks in particular? Because I always say the NHL GMs, they treat first round picks like gold bullion. They love a first round pick because it's a promissory note. But how has that changed with the league entering this phase now back to a rising cap world?
Well, I think, first round picks depends on the time of the year. Like at the trade deadline, picks aren't nearly as valuable. You're looking for players right now. Come draft time, though, first round picks, any picks are worth gold. So everybody, your scouts work all year, excited about drafting guys. They don't want to see picks just going away. But no, there is difference, and you're going to see a number of teams try to make big changes this year, or make big differences. And whether you can do it or not, it's a different case. And I think this year the draft, you're going to see a lot of movement. There's a lot of teams looking to move up, a lot of teams looking to move back, gather picks, and there's a lot of different teams that are in different stages of their process here. So it should make for an interesting few days, and I think it's just picking up now.
My final question for you, Brent, is that in having 7 picks dispersed between really among the top 50, does that, assuming that you're able to hang on to most of those or whatever, does that make you maybe a little bit more inclined to, particularly the late first round and the second round, maybe you might take a swing at the fences on a guy who, if you might have a gap where we have a first round pick and we'd have to trade up to get a guy. So how much would you be willing to a little bit more to take a risk on a high ceiling on a guy because you have multiple picks where there might be a little bit more risk involved?
Sure. Yeah, I've done that in the past, certainly. But there's, this draft, we'll have it in order. We have, we do it the same every year. We have tiers of players and layers of players. And if we feel that there's a guy that is still on the board and we'll try to trade up. If we feel that we can get value, we'll just move back 5 spots and get a similar player. We'll try to do that. But certainly when you have multiple picks like we have, you can do different things. And it also depends on what you maybe pick with your first 2 picks, whether you do something different or go for a different type of player and go off your list a little bit to maybe take a chance on a higher ceiling player or whatever the situation is. So, but those are the things we're going to play out. We've got a lot of work to do yet. We've had our meetings and everything, but we have a lot more discussions with all our guys, and with all those picks, we'll have it dialed in and have an idea what we want to do with each area, and it's an exciting time.
No doubt, having that many picks. My last question for you is sometimes iron sharpens iron. There's some scouts, and they like to get in there and really defend their position. And you have so many positions. It's like fighting a war on multiple fronts when you have so many picks. What are the meetings been like? At 6, we got this. This may be your option at 22. Late first round, second round. Here's the value. How we move back into the first round, maybe move up 2-4 picks. How have those meetings been as you guys prepare for this?
Yeah, no. Even in the top 10, there's not consensus. So it was. We had a lot of discussions, and it went back and forth, and eventually we have to make a decision and put guys in place. And then as you go down the list, it's the same thing. You got guys fighting for the guys in their area sometimes, but the good thing is our staffs work together for a long time, for the most part, with the exception of a few guys. So, they understand you can't always get your way, and sometimes it's a team need versus maybe a player that we have an abundance of, or whatever the situation we decide to do to move, create your list. But no, we got a lot of discussions, and there'll be a few heated ones yet. So
I love
that.
A
busy week the rest of the week and next week through Friday, Saturday. So
sometimes the scout goes in thinking he's not going to get his way, but things change on the floor, and he ends up getting his way.
That's some cases, you never know, and trades happen too. So things fall into place sometimes. It's funny how it works.
Yeah. Hey, Brent, thanks for doing this. We really appreciate it. We're obviously looking forward to this draft. This phase of the rebuild is now where the fun begins, and to have so much draft capital at the top 50 is going to be extremely exciting for fans, whether you exercise all those picks or use them in other ways as well. Thanks for doing this. Best of luck at the draft. And as always, we'll be checking in with you after to get the post-draft analysis from yourself and others as well. Thanks for doing this.
No problem, guys. Take care.
Bill and I continue now. We'll get into some more specific players. Some people may say, well, why didn't you ask Brent about Matthew Misa? Or he's not going. We've done this long enough. He's not going to tip his hand at exactly where they value certain guys. Matter of fact, you don't want that to happen at this point.
No, for sure. Sometimes you build a relationship with the scout, and they might share a tip or two. But in these kind of situations, nobody's going to tip their hand on anything. So you talk about general areas as to what a team looks for. Sometimes you can read between the lines a little bit too. So you might know a specific player of a specific type, we were asking about a certain attribute, and they might be willing to talk about the attribute. In your mind, that's these couple of guys. They're in that grouping. So that's really the reason for asking the kind of general questions as to what you look for, what the trends are in the draft, and whatever. So, but in terms of specific players, obviously happy to talk about anybody in particular.
Yeah, before we get to that, it's that I think that Brent gave us a lot of information in the tiebreaker situations.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, and when you get outside, the top 10, you get into more of those okay, we got this guy and this guy available. We didn't expect him to be there. We hope this guy would be, but now we have to reconsider because player X is now available along with the player we had targeted. And, that's where maybe size, fit can be just that 1%. You're still taking the best player available because you have basically evaluated the same, but there's a 1% differentiating factor that could swing it one way or the other.
For sure. And I mean, where Brent mentioned how highly they rate character, right? Yeah. And there are certain players in a draft who are either known for having maybe character questions or being known for having really high character. And I'll give you an example. Brady Martin is a player who across the board gets high ranks on character. Maybe a future potential NHL captain somewhere. Some people have likened him to Mike Richards, for example. And coming and saying, he might not be a superstar coming out of your draft, but this is a guy who's going to play in the league, if he's healthy, 15 years, and be in the NHL because he plays in a very NHL ready kind of a game, very physical kind of game, so there's not as much projection as to what kind of player he will be. That's just one example. I'm not saying the Flyers are going in that direction, but I do think one of the areas between the lines too is where they're picking at 6, at 22, and then the final pick of the first round. If they go for a position player and not for a goalie, because this is a year where they might pick a goalie with one of their late first round picks. This is just one of those drafts where that might play out that way. But in terms of deciding between player A or player B, if you're looking at the character perspective, well, that's definitely a point. And Brent also mentioned, on a related note, the size issue. They're not going to just bypass a guy who's smaller, but they're well aware of the trend to value size heavily with players, and that I mentioned the size and mobility combination because if they have both, they're both big and they can also skate. That pushes some guys up, whereas maybe you might be a little bit more patient with their development, but there's a potential for a higher ceiling in some cases. So I think things like that are valuable pieces of information. But at the same time, there's still a place for a smaller guy in there. Like I think if James Higgins is still on the board number 6, the Flyers are going to have a tough choice on their mind here, where that's the guy who came into this draft. Seems like often in drafts, the guy who came into the year or last year at this time, next year, he's going to be number 1. And in many cases, right, the Connor Bedards of the world, that is the case. They're still number 1. But
Shane Wright showed you that may not be the case,
right? Or may not be the case. But Higgins is a high skill guy who a year ago was the consensus number 1 guy. This year, he's not. He won't go first or second. Will he go 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th? If he's still there at 6, that's an awfully tempting place to go. That's the guy who might be in this year. I mean, sometimes he gets likened to Jack Hughes, for example. Is that a guy who come in and make an impact, be a high-end playmaker, give you a ton of skill? I mean, he's a smaller guy. We talked about the size issue. We talked about those kind of things, how rankings change. Incidentally, Martin was a late riser. He was a guy who had a great under-18 World Championships for Canada, and and now it's very common. I wouldn't even call him an off the board pick at this point. The first guy I saw really push him up in the Flyers range, and actually had the Flyers taking him in his mock, which doesn't mean that they will. But it was Craig Button, who we've had as a guest several times.
Yeah.
And now if you look at many different publications and pundits, it's very common now to see Martin up near the top. So I wouldn't even call him an off the board pick at this point. But if a guy like Hagens is there, do you go, yeah, boy, this is a guy who coming into the year, we thought we'd have to pick first to get him. He didn't have as great of a collegiate year as we want him to have. But geez, that upside's really hard to ignore. And you know, there's, and I think where Brent said too that there's going to be surprises, that the board order might not go in. You look at all the publications, and there might be a guy or two in there who is not in the top five in any of these lists who ends up going in the top five. Often it's a late riser, like Seneca a year ago was, you kept hearing he's rising, rising top three, top five.
Yeah. What's the degree of rising?
Right. But there very well might be some team that's in love with a certain prospect who he might be 15th on somebody else's list, but they love him, and they had that first rounder, and they're just sold on him, and that could easily shake up the board. That's part of why it's exciting.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we do a live draft, wow, okay, he's still there. I remember we were doing a live draft, a special broadcast a couple of years ago, and when the other Russian was taken, the Russian defenseman. All right, so Mechov wasn't taken 5th by Montreal. He wasn't taken 6th by Arizona. I was like, he's there. Yeah.
I remember us freaking out at the time. Are they going to take him? I'm like, this is crazy.
They have to. You can't bypass him there.
Yeah.
I mean, the Flyers were prepared to take a couple of other guys. It's not a secret that they liked Ryan Leonard. It's not a secret that they liked Dalibor Dvorsky. And those were guys they were talking about. If Mechov was off the board, all of a sudden they look up and Mechov was there for them, and it became a no-brainer at that point.
Yeah. And obviously they prepared for Mechov. They had him in town.
Yeah.
All of that prior. They really did the due diligence on Mechov prior, and because the uniqueness of his talent and the situation, obviously, a couple of years ago. Not that situation's changed a lot between Russia and Ukraine and all of that, but and the fact that when is he going to be here? The big question. He's a player with such talent and high-end skill that you're willing to wait 3 years. Well, you didn't have to. That's the interesting part. The other thing, Bill, we'll see how many of these first round or even into the second round picks they end up actually drafting players. Obviously, depends who you get at 6th. If you really, from their standpoint, a value standpoint, hit the home run at 6th, the guy that they expect to be there is there. Yeah. Does that make it more likely at 22 to then, as you asked Brent, take that swing and maybe go, you know what? Who's the guy? Who's the player? I can remember his name off the top of my head. He's going to play football this year, but he said he's committed to hockey.
Oh, yeah.
Is that Owen? I can't remember the kid's name. But the upside is there, but there's a little bit of hesitation from teams because he's going to play football this year in high school and try and win a state championship.
Yeah, that's that's something too where when you have a multitude of picks, you A, can be patient, and B, you can take a few more risks if you do end up hanging on to picks. This year, in addition to him, and I'm blanking on the name too, but in many drafts, if there's a Russian player or two that you like, and I'm not talking about Mechov type. I'm talking about a type who maybe is a little bit less scouted, but you really like him. And we have the multiple picks. If he's the guy, it's going to take us a while to bring him over. We're willing to wait on him. Whereas if you have that first round and you don't have a second round pick and you have to trade to get a second round pick and you have a gap, you're thinking, okay, our next pick might be number 75. Okay, then we really have to be, I don't say too safe, right? But you want to be safer with your first pick. The Flyers this year in a position, if they keep these picks, where they can take a chance at some guys, maybe a smaller player, maybe a guy who's a bit less scouted, maybe some of those injury guys, or a great athlete where maybe he's a little bit raw, but maybe he ends up playing a different sport. He has to decide where he wants to focus his energies. But let's go ahead and take a chance.
You had mentioned before, maybe the Flyers, if they use all 30 or 3 of the first round picks, they could take a goalie. I think it's important to remind people that if they draft a goalie, it doesn't mean that they don't have a high opinion of where Carson Bjarnason is right now or Zavragin. Yeah. I mean, obviously that's a position. I think you should draft one every year with your top 4, with a top by the 3rd round.
I mean, I'll give you, I've said this so many times, so people have read me for a while. I apologize. Mitch Hedberg used to tell a joke about how long it takes to cook a baked potato in a conventional oven. He said sometimes even if I don't want one, I'll just throw one in because by the time it's done, who knows?
Yeah.
Goalies are like that. Yeah. Goalies are like that. You're waiting probably 5 years to have any sense of what you might have in them, and goalies tend to mature later. They quite often they're not in the NHL till their mid-20s in some cases. The full spectrum in Europe, couple of years in the American League, a year at least of backing up in the NHL. So it's a while to have any sense of what you have. And I could go way back to the late 90s, early 2000s, where the Flyers were considered to have the best goaltending pool in the league. Flyers used a couple first-round picks. They used Bush, 95. Mm-hmm. The next year, they didn't have a first-round. They did. The year after that, Jean-Marc Pelletier. They didn't have a first-round pick in what year was it? 97, I think it was. First pick they had was in the 2nd round. They took another goalie, which is Jean-Marc Pelletier. That same draft year, they used a 5th-round pick on Anto Niittymaki, and then they picked Maxime Ouellet with the first-round pick the year after that. And of all of those guys, Bush and Niittymaki ended up being the best goalies. Yeah. But they didn't know it at the time. Everybody thought that Ouellet, who was the star on Team Canada, their starter in the World Juniors, actually played his first NHL game at 19, just turned out not to be ready, and didn't develop. You don't know. So you really need strength in numbers with your goaltending pool, and you need them coming at you from a variety of developmental standpoints, because unlike other positions, if you're trying to develop 2 goalies, they both need a place to play.
Yep.
So, that's also sometimes where maybe where is the ECHL useful? To me, the most useful place, not that there aren't some ECHL guys who end up playing in the NHL, even guys who have long careers ultimately, but a lot of guys get their start in the ECHL with goaltenders, like a Jonathan Quick started out in the ECHL mostly because he needed a place to play, needed the minutes.
Need a crease. There's only one crease.
Yeah. So that's where it's helpful, where you have a Russian goalie. Okay, he can stay over there where you're not on any kind of timetable or pressure to sign him. When he's ready, maybe the other guys in the NHL, Bjarnason. So you can stagger it, right? So if the Flyers do take a goalie this year, he'll probably play 2 years as junior. You're hoping he's playing World Juniors. 2 years out from now, you have a sense of, okay, how's Bjarnason coming along at the pro level? Where's Zavragin at? So it's not a reflection necessarily on anybody who's in your system. Really, it's just a reflection of, you think this is somebody who can play and might be able to play in the NHL over time. And not that goalies typically have a ton of trade value, but they have some. Where if somebody's a really hotshot prospect, but you have a young goalie in the NHL who's succeeding, that might be a trade piece somewhere too that might help swing a trade too. So flexibility is always a good thing. Options are always a good thing.
Yeah, when I look at goaltending, I always go back to the 05 draft, because early in that draft at 5th overall, Montreal snags Carey Price. And really shocks a lot of people, especially with some good French Canadian players that were available back in 05. Another goalie goes in the 1st round that year. It's Tuukka Rask, right? Yeah. And then you go all the way to the 3rd round. You mentioned Jonathan Quick. He's taken 72nd overall
Right.
in the third round, wins multiple cups. And also in that third round was Ben Bishop, good goaltender. Yeah, in the NHL, big body that maybe broke down a little earlier than people thought. Stalock came out of that draft at the goalie position. Flyers
Henrik Lundqvist was a deep pick.
Yeah.
Or you have and even when guys are right at the top, it does sometimes work out that the consensus, it's been a long time since the goalie's been taken really high in the first round, but back when it was common, I always used to save my Hockey News draft preview issues because they're always fun to look back at years later. But I love the 1990 preview for a number of reasons. But I love in there that Trevor Kidd, franchise goalie. Martin Ambrose, he's good. He was a first round pick, right? But Trevor, I mean, they have a feature story on Trevor Kidd in there. Like Trevor Kidd is just he's gonna be the guy, right? And listen, Brodeur was a highly regarded prospect, but he was just another guy.
Yeah.
So it's funny with goalies too, because the development is so unpredictable. You never know which goalie in a particular draft is going to end up being the best one.
Yeah, to go back and to do the redraft with hindsight is always fun. And when it comes to goaltending, it's like voodoo in a lot of ways.
Is.
I remember listening to an interview with Doug McLean going back to that 2005 draft. He took Brule in Columbus that year. They kind of got screwed up because Montreal took Carey Price. They thought Brule was going there, and he passed over Andrzej Kopitar. And Doug McLean said not taking Kopitar with that pick for Columbus probably cost him personally $30 million because he'd still be a GM in the league today.
Well, that's part of it too. Is that how much out on a limb is a team willing to go? Yeah. Right. If you go with a guy who's, just universally considered that this guy's going to be a player, don't know he's going to be a superstar, but he's going to be a player, and you play a hunch, and that hunch is wrong, ultimately doesn't prove it out. Yeah, that could cost you a career, or at least you have to go back several steps to rebuild credibility after coming up empty on something like that.
That's a 20-year haunt for Andrzej Kopitar, though.
It haunts you forever, right? You can, you go back in drafts where like Yager going fifth overall, and just as an example, or fourth, I think he went fourth, right after the Flyers picked third, picked Mike Ricci. Sometimes you have a guy who you look back at a draft, and Ricci's an example, played over 1,000 games in the league, was a Selke candidate guy, perennial 20-goal scorer, a team leader. But my goodness, you didn't pick Jaromir Jagr. So we messed that one up with no reflection on the guy you did pick. So teams are afraid of screwing up, but sometimes that means you go so safe that you miss out on someone better too. So I don't. It's when you go out, you go out on a limb, and the guy never plays pro, or just that they really just you miss the mark for some other reason other than some kind of catastrophic thing happened to him. Yeah, you go back and you just replay that and kick yourself for years. You don't get the hindsight of retro drafting if you're a GM or a scouting director, but guaranteed, they go back and they still like talking about when they got a guy right. With the late Jay Greenberg when he did Flyers at 50, when he talked to Simone Nolay, and Simone will be happy to tell you that he saw something in Patrick Sharp, who was a collegiate player at the time. Because
Vermont.
when you're getting a little bit more in the draft, it's really more about one scout's recommendation and who bangs their fist the loudest on the table. And he was insistent that they take Sharp, and Sharp ended up being an all-star. So that's scouts do go back at old drafts, and they will, because they're human. When they have the success of a guy that they found that maybe other guys didn't see, that's the fun of it all. I love this time of year. I love talking about drafts and upsides. I will also tell you, Jason, that I'm glad we're in the chairs we're in, and not in Danny's or Brent's, because I would not want to be the one making those decisions. We like to have the higher pay grade, but I will want that pressure of being the one to make some of those calls, because they're tough calls.
Yeah, and they're going to come with a lot of, people say, some people are going to say you did the right thing, and other people are going to say you did the wrong thing, and only time will tell. All right, we're going to wrap it up there. Well, I'm looking forward to the draft. It's fast approaching. Read Bill's work, total draft coverage at hockeyhotstove.com, not just on the Flyers and beyond. You can get that there. Also, Bill's work at NHL.com and PhiladelphiaFlyers.com. We'll talk to you Friday on a brand new episode of Flyers Daily.